May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. While Americans celebrated Germany's surrender in streets from Boston to Los Angeles, a different kind of history was being written in a small prisoner-of-war facility outside San Antonio, Texas. In a wooden barrack surrounded by mesquite trees and endless Texas sky, Captain Sarah Mitchell stood before 42 Japanese women prisoners, holding official repatriation orders from the War Department. She had prepared a simple speech about their return to Japan, about freedom and going home. But she never finished it, because halfway through her announcement, something unprecedented happened. A young woman named Emiko Sato stood up, her hands trembling, but her voice steady, and spoke words that would echo through American military history. "Captain Mitchell," she said in carefully practiced English, "some of us wish to discuss remaining here." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the Texas wind seemed to pause. Captain Mitchell had processed hundreds of German and Italian prisoners for repatriation over the past months. Not one had ever requested to stay. Yet here stood this slight Japanese woman, barely 24 years old, asking permission to remain in captivity rather than accept freedom in her own country. Behind Emiko, 13 other women slowly rose to their feet. Their faces showed the same mixture of determination and fear. These weren't hardened soldiers or fanatical believers in imperial ideology. They were communications specialists, nurses, administrative clerks who had been captured in the Philippines during the final months of the Pacific Campaign. Young women who had once served the emperor with pride, now asking their former enemies for sanctuary. The American guards exchanged bewildered glances. Sergeant Tom Rodriguez, whose family had ranched in Texas for 3 generations, removed his hat and scratched his head in confusion. He had spent 6 months working with these prisoners, watching them maintain their dignity and discipline, even in defeat. But this he had never expected. Captain Mitchell found her voice, though it came out softer than she intended. "Ladies, I need you to understand what you're asking. Repatriation means freedom. You would return to Japan, to your families, to everything you knew before the war." Emiko translated quickly for those whose English remained limited. When she finished, an older woman named Yuki Nakamura spoke in Japanese, her words firm despite tears on her face. Emiko translated, her own voice breaking slightly. "She says we understand perfectly, Captain. That is exactly why we wish to stay. The Japan we knew no longer exists. The families we remember may be gone, but here, in this Texas camp, we have discovered something we never expected to find." Captain Mitchell waited, knowing the next words would matter. "We have found kindness where we expected cruelty. We have tasted abundance where we were promised starvation. We have learned that everything our government told us about America and Americans was a lie." The captain looked at these 14 women, seeing in their faces a transformation she had witnessed developing over 6 long months. A transformation that had begun with something as simple and profound as a cheeseburger. November 19, 1944. The transport truck rolled through the gates of the hastily constructed facility outside San Antonio, carrying the first group of Japanese women prisoners to reach American soil. Unlike the large camps housing thousands of German and Italian men, this compound held only wooden barracks, a mess hall, and a small administrative building surrounded by barbed wire. It was designed for fewer than 50 prisoners, a temporary solution for a problem the War Department had never anticipated: what to do with captured Japanese military women. Captain Sarah Mitchell watched as 28 women climbed down from the truck, their dark blue uniforms dusty from the long journey from California. They had been captured in Manila 3 weeks earlier, serving as part of the Imperial Japanese Army's Support Corps. Now they stood in the Texas heat, their faces showing no emotion, their backs straight, despite obvious exhaustion. The oldest appeared to be in her mid-30s. The youngest looked barely 18. All maintained a disciplined silence that spoke volumes about their military training. Among them was 23-year-old Emiko Sato, a communications specialist from Osaka who had joined the military auxiliary service in 1942. She carried nothing but a small canvas bag containing a change of clothes and a photograph of her parents standing in front of their modest home. That photograph represented everything she had left of her previous life. She had no way of knowing if her parents were even alive, if Osaka still stood, or if anything she remembered about home remained true. The first days established a pattern of mutual wariness. The Japanese women spoke only to each other in hushed conversations. They ate their meals in complete silence, sitting in rigid formations that mimicked military discipline. They followed every instruction with mechanical precision, their faces carefully neutral. Captain Mitchell recognized this behavior. It was pride maintaining itself through ritual, dignity preserved through perfect compliance. The American guards, mostly young men from Texas, ranching families and small towns, didn't know how to interact with these foreign women prisoners. They had been trained to guard German soldiers, Italian officers, men they could understand even as enemies. But these Japanese women existed in a different category entirely. Their language was incomprehensible, their customs mysterious, their thoughts completely opaque. Sergeant Tom Rodriguez, whose family ranch bordered the camp property, found the situation profoundly uncomfortable. He had lost a cousin at Pearl Harbor and another in the Philippines. Yet watching these women maintain their quiet discipline, he couldn't summon the hatred he expected to feel. They looked exhausted, displaced, and very young. Private Jack Morrison, barely 20 years old himself, was even more confused. He had been raised to treat women with courtesy, to offer help and protection, but these were enemy soldiers, captured serving the nation that had attacked America. The contradiction left him uncertain how to behave, so he maintained careful distance and formal politeness. Akiko Tanaka was 19 years old and had stopped eating on the 4th day of her captivity. She sat in the mess hall during meal times, staring at the unfamiliar American food with undisguised suspicion. The other prisoners noticed but said nothing, maintaining the group's code of silent endurance. Captain Mitchell noticed too, and it worried her. The girl was already thin, her uniform hanging loose on her small frame. A few more days without food could become a medical crisis. Private Jack Morrison had been watching Akiko as well, though he tried not to be obvious about it. There was something heartbreaking about her rigid refusal, the way she sat with her hands folded while the other women ate their rations. On the 7th day, he made a decision that went against every regulation about fraternization with prisoners. During his break, he walked to the mess hall kitchen and asked the cook for something special. 20 minutes later, he approached Akiko's table carrying a tray. The other Japanese women watched him with suspicious eyes as he set it down in front of the girl. On the plate was a carefully prepared hamburger, the meat cooked medium, topped with bright yellow cheese that had melted into the edges. Beside it sat fresh sliced tomatoes, crisp lettuce, and golden French fries still steaming. It was the kind of meal his mother made on Sundays, simple American comfort food. Akiko stared at the burger as if it might be poisonous. She had never seen cheese before, never encountered this strange substance that looked like melted plastic. The smell was foreign, unsettling, completely unlike anything from her childhood. Jack stood awkwardly, realizing he had no way to explain what he had brought her. He pointed at the burger, then at his mouth, trying to pantomime eating. Akiko's expression remained hostile, but her eyes betrayed her. She was starving. Emiko Sato, sitting 2 tables away, had been watching the exchange. Her English was better than most, learned from a missionary school in Osaka. She stood and approached slowly, speaking to Akiko in rapid Japanese. The younger girl responded with sharp words, but Emiko persisted, her tone gentle but firm. Finally, Emiko turned to Jack and spoke in halting English. "She think you poison food. She think American want to kill prisoner." Jack's face flushed with shock and hurt. The thought had never occurred to him. He picked up the burger from Akiko's plate and took a large bite himself, chewing and swallowing deliberately. Then he set it back down and stepped away, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. The gesture was clumsy, but sincere. Akiko watched him with widening eyes, seeing something that didn't match what she had been taught about American brutality. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she picked up the burger with both hands. The cheese stretched between the bun and the meat, creating golden strings that fascinated and disgusted her simultaneously. She took the smallest possible bite. The taste that filled Akiko's mouth was unlike anything in her experience. The cheese was rich, salty, creamy in a way that made her tongue feel coated. Japanese cuisine had no equivalent for this strange dairy product. Nothing in her 19 years had prepared her palate for the intensity of melted American cheese. Her first instinct was to spit it out. The texture felt wrong, the flavor too bold, too different from the subtle tastes of miso and rice and carefully prepared fish that had defined her understanding of food. But she was desperately hungry, and beneath the strangeness of the cheese, she detected something else. The meat was seasoned simply but well, the bun soft and slightly sweet, the vegetables crisp and fresh. She took another bite, then another, her resistance crumbling under the assault of flavors and the undeniable relief of finally eating after 7 days of stubborn refusal. The other Japanese women watched in silence as Akiko devoured the entire burger, then started on the French fries. These too were revelation, crispy and salty, unlike anything served in the military rations they had received in Manila or during their capture. When she finished, Akiko looked up at Private Morrison with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not gratitude exactly, but perhaps the beginning of confusion about who her enemies actually were. She spoke in Japanese, and Emiko translated quietly. She says, "The yellow substance on the meat. What is this thing?" Jack smiled, relieved that his gesture had worked. "Cheese," he said, speaking slowly and clearly. "It's made from milk, from cows. Cheese." He repeated the word, pointing at his mouth. Emiko practiced the unfamiliar sound, her tongue struggling with the English pronunciation. "Chizu," she attempted, then explained to Akiko in Japanese. The younger girl's eyes widened further. She knew about milk, had seen it occasionally in wealthy households before the war, but the idea of transforming milk into this solid yellow substance seemed almost magical. That evening, word spread through the barracks about Akiko's surrender to American food. The women debated in hushed voices whether accepting such food represented weakness or pragmatism. They were prisoners, after all, and refusing to eat served no strategic purpose. But more than tactics, they were beginning to question the propaganda they had been taught about American cruelty and deprivation. If America was starving, and desperate as their officers had claimed, why did their captors have such abundance to share? Why did this young soldier care whether one Japanese prisoner ate or starved? Captain Mitchell heard about the incident from Sergeant Rodriguez, who had observed the entire interaction. She made a mental note to commend Private Morrison for his initiative while also reminding him about appropriate boundaries with prisoners. But privately, she recognized that something significant had occurred. The first crack had appeared in the wall of mutual mistrust. Private Jack Morrison had grown up on a small ranch outside Fredericksburg, Texas, where his family raised cattle and grew cotton. He had joined the Army in 1943, 3 weeks after his 18th birthday, expecting to fight in Europe or the Pacific. Instead, he found himself assigned to guard duty at a prisoner of war facility, watching over women who looked at him with undisguised hatred. It wasn't the war he had imagined, but he took his duty seriously. After the incident with Akiko and the cheeseburger, Jack found himself paying more attention to the Japanese prisoners' daily routines. He noticed how they maintained perfect discipline even in small things, how they kept their barracks immaculate, how they moved with quiet efficiency through every task. He noticed their isolation too, the way they existed in a bubble of Japanese language and customs that excluded all American contact beyond necessary interactions. It reminded him of newborn calves separated from the herd, wary and defensive, unsure of their place in an unfamiliar environment. Jack's grandmother had taught him that kindness cost nothing and could change everything. She had shown him how to gentle a spooked horse, how to coax a sick calf back to health, how patience and consistency could overcome fear. He began to apply those same principles to his interactions with the prisoners, even though he knew they couldn't understand his words. During recreation periods, he would sit near the barracks doing simple tasks, repairing equipment or whittling small wooden figures from mesquite branches. He never approached too directly, never demanded attention, just maintained a steady, non-threatening presence. The Japanese women noticed, though they pretended not to. Emiko Sato, whose English continued to improve through careful observation, began to understand that this young American soldier was deliberately trying to make them comfortable. His body language was different from the other guards, less rigid, more open. He smiled easily, not with mockery, but with genuine warmth. When he did need to give instructions, he used simple words and patient gestures rather than harsh commands. One afternoon, Jack brought his work outside the barracks, repairing a bridle from his family's ranch. The leather work required careful attention, threading new straps through brass buckles, treating the aged material with oil to restore its suppleness. Akiko and two other young women watched from the barracks window, fascinated by the precise movements of his hands. Jack noticed their attention and held up the bridle, gesturing to show how the pieces fit together. Then he did something unexpected. He walked to the window and offered the bridle through the bars, indicating that Akiko should try the repair work herself. The girl hesitated, looking back at Emiko for guidance. The older woman shrugged, curious about what the American intended. Akiko reached through and took the leather, examining the worn strap that needed replacement. Jack handed her his tools and through gestures showed her what needed to be done. December arrived with unexpected cold, the Texas winter proving that even the southern state could turn harsh when the wind shifted north. Inside the camp, the Japanese women huddled in their barracks, wearing every layer of clothing they possessed. But the physical cold was nothing compared to the emotional chill that settled over them as weeks passed without any word from home. The International Red Cross had established procedures for prisoners to contact their families, and every woman in the compound had submitted carefully written letters in early November. They had addressed them to parents, siblings, husbands, children left behind when they deployed to the Philippines. Each letter contained the same desperate questions. Are you alive? Is our home still standing? Do you know where I am? By mid-December, not a single reply had arrived. Captain Mitchell watched the women's hope slowly transform into something darker. They began to understand that silence might mean more than delayed mail service. Reports filtering back from the Pacific Theater painted a grim picture. American bombing campaigns had devastated Japanese cities. Osaka, Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe, all had suffered massive firebombing raids that killed tens of thousands and left millions homeless. The infrastructure necessary for something as simple as mail delivery had likely ceased to exist in many regions. Emiko Sato sat in the camp's small library, a converted storage room with a dozen English books and several outdated American newspapers. She had been studying English grammar, driven by a desperate need to understand more about this country that held her captive. But today, she couldn't concentrate on the textbook in front of her. Her letter had been addressed to her parents in Osaka. She had written it 3 times before finding words that felt adequate, explaining her capture without causing shame, asking for news without revealing the depth of her fear. Now she understood that letter might never reach them. More terrifying, they might no longer exist to receive it. Yuki Nakamura, at 34, the oldest woman in the compound, had written to her husband and 2 young daughters in Yokohama. She had been serving as a nursing administrator in Manila when captured, believing her work supported humanitarian efforts. Now 6 months had passed without any word from her family. She spent her evenings staring at a small photograph of her daughters, ages 6 and 8, their faces frozen in time while she had no idea how they had changed or if they had survived. The uncertainty was becoming unbearable. Captain Mitchell recognized the signs of deepening depression among her prisoners. The women moved through their daily routines mechanically, their earlier defiant pride replaced by hollow resignation. They still maintained discipline and order, still kept their quarters spotless, and followed every regulation. But the life had drained from their faces. They were beginning to look like people who had lost everything and were simply waiting for confirmation of that loss. She called Sergeant Rodriguez into her office one evening in mid-December, closing the door for privacy. "Tom, we need to do something for these women. Christmas is coming, and they're falling apart from uncertainty and isolation." Sergeant Tom Rodriguez understood Christmas as a time of family, faith, and abundance. His Mexican-American family celebrated with tamales, luminarias lining the driveway, and midnight mass at the small Catholic church in town. The idea of extending that celebration to Japanese prisoners felt strange, possibly inappropriate. These were enemy soldiers, after all, but he had watched them deteriorating over the past weeks, seen the hollow look in their eyes as hope of contact with their families faded. Captain Mitchell was right. Something needed to break through their despair. He approached Private Morrison with the captain's proposal, expecting resistance. Instead, Jack's face lit up with immediate enthusiasm. "My mom always says Christmas is about showing love to people who need it most," he said. "Reckon these ladies qualify." Together they planned something modest. They couldn't offer much. Regulations limited what prisoners could receive, but they could offer warmth, small decorations, and perhaps most importantly, acknowledgement that these women were human beings, far from home, during a season of family and connection. On December 23rd, the guards began decorating the mess hall with pine branches cut from trees on Sergeant Rodriguez's family ranch. The sharp scent of evergreen filled the room, mixing with the usual smells of cooking food and floor wax. They strung popcorn into garlands, a task that amused the Japanese women who watched through the windows with confusion. Emiko asked in her careful English what purpose the food string served, and Jack tried to explain the American tradition of edible decorations. The explanation got lost in translation, but his enthusiasm bridged the language gap. Captain Mitchell had requisitioned additional food supplies, calling in favors from the base quartermaster. On Christmas Eve, the mess hall would serve a special meal, including roasted chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, fresh bread with butter, and apple pie for dessert. It was food abundance on a scale the Japanese women had never experienced, even before the war. The cook, a large man from Louisiana named Samuel Washington, threw himself into the preparations with surprising dedication. "These girls are somebody's daughters," he told the guards. "They deserve one good meal, war or no war." The Japanese women observed these preparations with bewilderment turning slowly to cautious curiosity. Yuki Nakamura approached Emiko one evening, speaking in rapid Japanese that Emiko later translated to Captain Mitchell. "Mrs. Nakamura wants to know if we are permitted to contribute something to this celebration. She says in Japan, it is shameful to receive hospitality without offering something in return." Captain Mitchell considered the request carefully. Allowing prisoners to participate might cross boundaries she wasn't sure should be crossed, but she recognized the deeper meaning in the offer. These women needed to feel useful, needed to contribute, rather than simply receive charity. "Ask what they would like to offer," she told Emiko. That evening, the Japanese women gathered in their barracks and made a decision that would surprise everyone, including themselves. Christmas morning arrived cold and clear, the Texas sky brilliant blue and endless. Inside the mess hall, the Japanese women filed in for breakfast to find tables arranged differently than usual. Instead of the institutional rows, they had been organized into smaller groupings that suggested community rather than captivity. The pine decorations filled the room with forest scent, and someone had fashioned a small tree from branches, decorating it with the popcorn garlands and bits of colored paper folded into origami shapes that the Japanese women had contributed the night before. But the planned celebration was interrupted by the arrival of a courier from Army headquarters carrying a packet of newspapers and official documents. Captain Mitchell signed for the delivery, then froze as she glanced at the top newspaper. The headline was stark and impossible to ignore. Horror discovered in Pacific Theater, Japanese treatment of prisoners revealed. Below the headline were photographs that made her stomach turn. Images of emaciated Allied prisoners of war, barely alive after years in Japanese camps. Detailed accounts of systematic brutality, starvation, forced labor, and execution of those too weak to work. The Bataan Death March, where thousands of American and Filipino prisoners had died during forced transfer. Stories from survivors about guards who withheld food and water as punishment, about men beaten to death for minor infractions, about systematic dehumanization that defied basic conventions of warfare. Captain Mitchell's first instinct was to hide these newspapers, to prevent the Japanese prisoners from seeing evidence of their country's atrocities. But even as she considered it, she knew that approach was wrong. These women would eventually learn these truths. Better they confront them now in a controlled environment than discover them later without context or support. She called Sergeant Rodriguez and Private Morrison into her office, showing them the newspapers. Both men's faces hardened as they read, remembering their own reasons for serving, their own losses to Japanese aggression. "These women need to see this," Mitchell said quietly. "They need to understand what their country did in their name." An hour later, she arranged the newspapers on tables in the library, calling Emiko Sato to translate her announcement. "Ladies, I have received publications from Army headquarters that contain disturbing information about Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners. I believe you have a right and perhaps a responsibility to read these accounts. They are difficult, but they are truthful." Emiko's translation came out halting, her voice uncertain. The women filed into the library slowly, sensing something significant was happening. Yuki Nakamura reached the first newspaper before the others, her English just sufficient to understand the headline. Her face went pale as she picked it up, her hands beginning to shake. What followed was 3 hours of silent horror as the Japanese women confronted photographs and testimonies that destroyed everything they believed about their country's honor. They had been taught that Japanese soldiers treated prisoners with dignity, that the emperor's forces fought with nobility and respect for the rules of war. The days following Christmas passed in stunned silence. The Japanese women moved through their routines mechanically, but something fundamental had broken inside them. They gathered in small groups during evening hours, speaking in hushed Japanese about the photographs and testimonies they had read. Some cried, others sat in rigid denial, insisting the American newspapers must be propaganda, lies designed to justify bombing Japanese cities. But Emiko Sato, whose sharp intelligence had always cut through comfortable deceptions, forced them to confront uncomfortable questions. "If these accounts are lies," she asked her companions one evening, "then why do they include names, dates, locations? Why do they show photographs of specific men with documented service records?" The others had no answer that satisfied. Yuki Nakamura, who had served in medical administration, found the accounts particularly devastating. She had believed she was supporting humanitarian efforts, helping to care for Japan's wounded soldiers. Now she wondered if the medical supplies she had processed had been deliberately withheld from enemy prisoners while Japanese soldiers received treatment. Had she been complicit in atrocities without knowing it? The question of complicity haunted all of them. They had served willingly, believing they were defending their homeland against American aggression. They had worn their uniforms with pride, had performed their duties with dedication and skill. Now they confronted the possibility that every action they had taken, however innocent it seemed, had supported a system of systematic cruelty. The knowledge created a chasm between who they thought they were and who they might actually have been. It was Akiko Tanaka, the youngest among them, who first spoke the thought that others were afraid to voice. Perhaps the Americans were right to capture us. Perhaps we deserve to be treated as they treated us in those camps. Emiko translated this to Captain Mitchell during one of their daily meetings, and the captain's response surprised her. "No," Mitchell said firmly. "What was done to those prisoners was wrong regardless of who committed it. We don't treat you well because you deserve it. We treat you well because that's who we choose to be." The distinction was subtle but profound. The Americans were not offering kindness as reward for Japanese innocence. They were offering it as expression of American values, regardless of what Japan had done. It was a moral framework that existed independent of enemy behavior, and the Japanese women struggled to understand it. This new understanding manifested in unexpected ways, particularly around food. The mess hall had continued serving American meals throughout the past weeks, but the prisoners had maintained emotional distance from it, eating for survival rather than enjoyment. Now something shifted. Akiko began asking Jack Morrison questions about different foods, trying to understand not just what they were, but what they meant. Why did Americans eat so much meat? What was the purpose of dessert after every meal? Why did they put cheese on everything? Emiko Sato had never asked to become the bridge between two worlds, but her facility with English made it inevitable. What had begun as simple translation of orders and announcements had evolved into something far more complex. She found herself mediating not just language, but entire worldviews, explaining American concepts that had no Japanese equivalent and Japanese traditions that baffled the Texas Guards. The responsibility weighed on her increasingly as the gap between her two roles widened. To the Americans, she was becoming an ally, a trusted interpreter who could explain the mysterious behavior of her companions. To the Japanese women, she remained one of them, but also someone who was changing in ways that made them uncomfortable. Captain Mitchell had begun calling Emiko into her office for daily meetings that went far beyond practical translation needs. They discussed the women's emotional states, their fears about returning to Japan, their growing confusion about identity and loyalty. Emiko found herself being honest in ways that felt dangerous, admitting things about Japanese propaganda and indoctrination that she had never questioned before her capture. "We were taught that Americans were demons," she told the captain one afternoon. "Literally demons, not fully human. We were told you would torture us, violate us, that death was preferable to capture. Everything we were taught was wrong." The captain listened without judgment, recognizing that Emiko needed to voice these realizations to process them. But being honest with Americans meant being increasingly isolated from her Japanese companions. They noticed how comfortable Emiko had become speaking English, how naturally she laughed at Private Morrison's jokes even when they didn't fully translate into Japanese. Some whispered that she was becoming too American, forgetting her duty to her emperor and country. Yuki Nakamura defended her, pointing out that Emiko's role was essential and difficult, that someone had to build connections with their captors. But even Yuki noticed the change. Emiko was beginning to think in English for simple concepts, to reach for American words before Japanese ones. Her identity was shifting in ways none of them had expected. The burden became unbearable on a cold January evening when a new batch of newspapers arrived with photographs from recently liberated Japanese prisoner camps in the Philippines. The images were even more horrific than the previous ones, showing the skeletal remains of American soldiers who had been systematically starved. Captain Mitchell asked Emiko to translate the articles for the other women, believing they needed to understand the full scope of their country's actions. Emiko spent 3 hours reading aloud in Japanese, her voice breaking repeatedly as she described conditions that defied comprehension. When she finished, several women were crying. 2 others looked at her with open hostility, as if she were personally responsible for the content she had translated. That night, Emiko lay awake in her bunk, staring at the ceiling and questioning everything. Who was she now? Not fully Japanese anymore, certainly not American, but something undefined and uncomfortable in between. She carried knowledge that her companions didn't want to hear, and loyalty to captors who couldn't fully trust her. She existed in a liminal space that grew larger and lonelier with each passing day. February 1945 brought news that changed everything. The reports came through official military channels first, then through newspapers that Captain Mitchell could no longer justify hiding from her prisoners. American B-29 bombers had conducted massive firebombing raids on Tokyo, dropping incendiary devices that created firestorms visible from 100 miles away. The attacks had killed over 100,000 civilians in a single night, destroying 16 square miles of the densely populated capital. Similar raids had devastated Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Yokohama. The Japan that existed in the prisoners' memories was being systematically erased from existence. Yuki Nakamura collapsed when she read that Yokohama had been bombed. Her family lived there, her 2 daughters and husband in a wooden house that would have burned like kindling in the firestorm. For weeks she had clung to hope that her unanswered letters simply meant disrupted mail service. Now she confronted the likelihood that her family was dead, that she had been writing to ghosts. She stopped eating, stopped speaking, sat in her bunk, staring at nothing, while the other women tried unsuccessfully to comfort her. Captain Mitchell authorized special medical attention, but there was no medicine for grief of this magnitude. Emiko's parents lived in Osaka, which had suffered similar devastation. She read the casualty estimates with numb horror, understanding statistically that her parents were almost certainly dead. The house she had grown up in, the neighborhood she had played in as a child, the temple where her family had worshipped for generations, all likely reduced to ash and rubble. She was 24 years old and effectively an orphan, though she had no official confirmation and likely never would. The infrastructure for tracking individual deaths had ceased to exist. Millions of Japanese civilians had simply vanished into fire and smoke. The younger women took the news with visible desperation. Akiko Tanaka, who came from a small fishing village near Hiroshima, had better odds that her family survived since rural areas had been spared the worst bombing. But she had no way to contact them, no means of confirming their safety. She began having nightmares, waking the barracks with screams in Japanese that Emiko translated as desperate calls for her mother. The collective trauma created a new bond among the prisoners. They had lost their individual families, but were beginning to recognize they might be all the family each other had left. Private Jack Morrison watched these women grieve and felt his own assumptions challenged. He had celebrated news of successful bombing raids, seeing them as justified revenge for Pearl Harbor and Japanese atrocities. But watching Yuki Nakamura waste away from grief, seeing Akiko's nightmares, he began to understand that war's victims included people who had never chosen to fight. These women had served their country, yes, but they had also been lied to, manipulated by propaganda, sent into service believing they were defending their homes. Now their homes no longer existed, and they were left with nothing but questions about what they had sacrificed everything for. March brought the first real warmth to central Texas, bluebonnets blooming in wild profusion across the fields surrounding the camp. The seasonal renewal felt cruelly ironic to the Japanese women who watched spring arrive while contemplating a future that held no promise of new beginnings. Captain Mitchell received preliminary orders from the War Department regarding eventual repatriation procedures. The war in Europe was clearly ending, and military planners were beginning to consider what would happen to the thousands of prisoners held in American camps when hostilities ceased. The Japanese prisoners presented unique complications since their homeland was still actively at war and would likely remain so for months or years to come. Captain Mitchell called Emiko into her office to discuss the orders, knowing this conversation would be difficult. The War Department is planning for eventual repatriation once Japan surrenders, she explained. All prisoners will be processed and returned to their home countries as quickly as transportation can be arranged. I need to prepare your group for this reality." Emiko translated the captain's words in her mind before responding, already seeing the complications. "Captain, with respect, what are we being returned to? The cities where most of us lived no longer exist. Our families are dead or scattered. Japan itself will be occupied territory, defeated and destroyed. What kind of repatriation is that?" The question hung between them, neither woman having a good answer. Mitchell had been thinking about this exact problem for weeks, losing sleep over the ethical implications of sending these women back to a devastated homeland where they would likely face starvation, homelessness, and persecution for having been captured. In traditional Japanese culture, surrender meant dishonor. These women would return not as heroes but as failures who had shamed their families and emperor by allowing themselves to be taken alive. They would face rejection from the very society they had served. "I don't have answers," Mitchell admitted finally, "but military regulations are clear. Prisoners of war must be repatriated when hostilities end. It's required by the Geneva Convention." Emiko nodded slowly, understanding the captain's position, but also recognizing the cruel absurdity of the situation. They would be freed from American captivity only to face Japanese captivity of a different kind. Trapped in a destroyed country with no resources, no family, and the stigma of capture marking them as dishonorable. Some of the women had begun discussing this privately, speaking in hushed Japanese about their fears of returning home. That evening, Emiko gathered the women in the barracks and explained Captain Mitchell's message. The conversation that followed lasted until nearly midnight, voices rising and falling as they confronted the impossible choice that was approaching. Yuki Nakamura spoke first, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "I have nothing to return to. My family is dead. My home is destroyed. Japan itself is dying. Why should I choose to die with it?" Others nodded agreement, but some argued that duty required them to return regardless of personal cost. They had served the emperor, and that service didn't end simply because circumstances became difficult. April 15, 1945. The war in Europe had just ended, and news of German surrender dominated American newspapers. For the Japanese prisoners at the San Antonio facility, Germany's defeat carried ominous implications. If Germany could fall despite years of seeming invincibility, Japan's defeat was inevitable. The question was no longer whether the war would end, but what they would do when it did. That night, unable to sleep, 14 women gathered quietly in the corner of their barracks, speaking in whispers to avoid waking those who had finally found rest. Emiko Sato, Yuki Nakamura, Akiko Tanaka, and 11 others whose lives had become intertwined through shared captivity and shared loss. They spoke in Japanese, the language of their childhoods and their secrets, discussing something that felt simultaneously treasonous and necessary. What if they asked to stay in America rather than accept repatriation to Japan? The idea had been growing among them for weeks, but speaking it aloud made it real in a way that frightened them all. Yuki articulated what others were thinking. "We have lost everything that tied us to Japan. Our families are gone, our homes destroyed, our country defeated and shamed. What are we returning to except more suffering?" Akiko, who at 19 was the youngest in the group, added her own fear. "They will hate us there. We were captured, we surrendered, we survived when we should have chosen death. Japanese society will never forgive that dishonor." Others voiced practical concerns. Japan would be occupied territory, controlled by American forces, but governed by military law. Food would be scarce, shelter uncertain, employment nearly impossible for women marked as former soldiers. They would be refugees in their own homeland, worse than refugees because they carried the stain of military failure. Here in Texas, despite being prisoners, they had been treated with unexpected dignity. They had enough food, clean quarters, medical care, and Americans who showed them kindness, despite having every reason for hatred. Private Morrison brought Akiko extra blankets when she was cold. Sergeant Rodriguez had taught several of them basic English with patient good humor. Captain Mitchell had shown them respect even when discussing their country's atrocities, but choosing to stay meant more than practical considerations. It meant acknowledging that Japan had been wrong, that the emperor they had served had led them into dishonorable war. It meant accepting that their enemies had been right, that American values of dignity and human rights were superior to Japanese militarism and blind obedience. It meant becoming traitors to everything they had believed in their entire lives. The decision required not just choosing a different country, but choosing to become different people. Emiko understood this better than most, having already begun the transformation through her work as translator. "We cannot stay Japanese and stay in America," she said quietly. "If we choose this, we must be willing to become something new. Not fully American, perhaps, but no longer fully Japanese either." The conversation continued until dawn began to lighten the Texas sky. By this time the wake-up bell rang, they had reached consensus. 14 women would request permission to remain in American custody rather than accept repatriation. They would face whatever consequences came from that choice together. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The date Captain Sarah Mitchell had scheduled to announce official repatriation procedures to her Japanese prisoners. She stood in the mess hall that morning, holding papers from the War Department, preparing to explain the process that would eventually send these 42 women back to Japan. She had rehearsed her speech multiple times, trying to find words that acknowledged the difficulty of their situation while maintaining military professionalism. But she never got to deliver that speech, because Emiko Sato stood before she could begin, and the young translator's hands were shaking. "Captain Mitchell, may I speak for some of us?" Emiko's English had become nearly flawless over the past 6 months, but her voice carried the weight of a decision that terrified her. Mitchell nodded, sensing something significant was about to happen. Emiko took a deep breath, aware that the next words would change her life irrevocably. "Some of us wish to discuss remaining here in America rather than accepting repatriation to Japan." The silence that followed was absolute. Every American guard in the room froze, shocked by words they had never imagined hearing. Even the Japanese women who had not been part of the decision looked stunned. Mitchell recovered her composure quickly, though her mind was racing through the unprecedented implications. "Miss Sato, I need you to understand what you're asking. Repatriation means freedom. You would return to your homeland, to whatever remains of your families and communities. Are you certain you understand what you're requesting?" Behind Emiko, 13 other women stood slowly. Yuki Nakamura, Akiko Tanaka, and 11 others whose names had become familiar to the American staff over months of daily interaction. They stood together, their faces showing determination mixed with profound fear. Emiko continued, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "Captain, we understand perfectly. That is exactly why we wish to stay. The Japan we knew no longer exists. Our families are dead or scattered beyond recovery. Our homes are destroyed. But here, we have discovered something unexpected." She paused, searching for words adequate to express transformation that went beyond simple vocabulary. "We were taught that Americans were demons without mercy or honor. We believed you would torture us, that capture meant endless suffering. Instead, we found kindness where we expected cruelty. We found abundance where we were promised starvation. We found dignity offered to us, even as enemies." Yuki spoke then in Japanese, and Emiko translated. "Mrs. Nakamura says her family in Yokohama is almost certainly dead from the firebombing. She has nothing to return to, except memories and ash. But here, she has found purpose working in the camp medical facility. Here, she has found Americans who treat her as a human being despite everything her country did to theirs. Akiko added her voice, speaking directly in halting English she had been practicing for weeks. America, give me food when I hungry. Give me blanket when I cold. Teach me English when I want it learn. Japan, never ask what I want. America, ask every day. Captain Mitchell's urgent telegram to the War Department created confusion at the highest levels of military command. No precedent existed for enemy prisoners requesting to remain in captivity rather than accept freedom. The legal complications were staggering. Technically, the women were still prisoners of war, subject to Geneva Convention protocols requiring repatriation, but their request suggested they might qualify for refugee or displaced person status, categories that carried different legal implications. Washington debated for 3 weeks while the 14 women waited in limbo, continuing their daily routines, but carrying the uncertainty of their unprecedented request. The story leaked to local newspapers in early June. Japanese prisoners choose America over Japan, read the headline in the San Antonio Express. The article described the women's request in terms that emphasized their transformation and the kindness of their American captors. Reaction in the surrounding community was immediate and mixed. Some residents wrote angry letters to the editor, arguing that enemy soldiers should not receive special privileges while American boys were still dying in the Pacific. Why should Japanese prisoners be allowed to stay when they had served the nation that attacked Pearl Harbor? Others saw the situation differently, particularly families who had interacted with the prisoners through church outreach programs. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, a widow whose son had died at Guadalcanal, surprised everyone by writing a passionate defense of the women's request. "My boy died fighting Japanese soldiers," she wrote, "but these young women are not the same as the men who killed him. They were lied to by their government, same as our boys were sent to fight without fully understanding what they faced. If they want to stay in America and learn to live by our values, isn't that the best possible victory? Isn't that proving that American ideals can transform even our enemies?" Her letter sparked intense community discussion, forcing residents to confront complicated questions about justice, mercy, and what it meant to be American. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Reverend Thomas Mackenzie, pastor of the First Methodist Church in San Antonio, organized a meeting of local families willing to sponsor former enemy prisoners. He had been conducting weekly services at the camp for months, getting to know the Japanese women through Emiko's translation. He believed deeply that Christianity required practical action, not just comfortable words. These women need sponsors, employment, and housing if they're going to transition from prisoners to residents, he told his congregation. Are we willing to put our faith into practice by helping them? 23 families volunteered, more than enough to support 14 women. Private Jack Morrison's parents were among the volunteers. His mother wrote to him saying that any young woman brave enough to choose American values over her own country's hatred deserved a chance at a new life. The Hendersons, a school teacher and her engineer husband, specifically requested to sponsor Emiko, impressed by her intelligence and her obvious struggle to reconcile competing loyalties. Dr. William Hayes, the civilian physician who consulted at the camp, offered to sponsor Yuki Nakamura and help her pursue nursing certification. Not all the Japanese women chose to stay. Of the original 42 prisoners at the San Antonio facility, 28 decided to accept repatriation when Japan eventually surrendered. Their reasons varied, but all involved some form of duty or hope that pulled them back toward their devastated homeland. For some, the decision came from traditional values about loyalty and obligation that no amount of American kindness could overcome. For others, it reflected an inability to imagine life outside Japanese language and culture, even if that life would be difficult. 5 women who had initially joined the request to stay changed their minds after weeks of deliberation, concluding that the uncertainty of starting completely new lives in America was more frightening than returning to known devastation in Japan. Chieko Yamada, a 30-year-old communications specialist from Nagoya, explained her decision through Emiko's translation. I understand why some wish to stay. I feel the same gratitude for American treatment, but I cannot abandon Japan when it needs rebuilding most. Educated women will be necessary to help our country recover. If all of us who learned better ways of thinking choose to stay in America, who will teach those lessons in Japan? Her argument carried moral weight that others struggled to dismiss. Perhaps choosing the harder path of return actually represented greater courage than choosing the comfort of remaining. Others made decisions based on fragile hope about family. 3 women had received letters through the Red Cross indicating that family members had survived the war, though details were scarce. They clung to those thin threads of connection, believing that reuniting with surviving relatives was worth any hardship. One woman had a son she had left with her parents when she deployed to the Philippines in 1943. He would be 7 years old now, possibly orphaned if her parents had died in the bombing, but possibly alive and waiting for her return. No amount of American abundance could substitute for the possibility of seeing her child again. The division, the chemna, between those staying and those returning created unexpected tension in the barracks. Some women who chose repatriation viewed those staying as traitors who had abandoned Japanese identity too easily. Others harbored jealousy, wishing they could make the same choice, but feeling constrained by duty or fear of breaking completely with their past. Those choosing to stay sometimes felt defensive, questioning whether their decision was brave or cowardly, principled or merely convenient. Emiko found herself mediating between the groups, trying to help everyone understand that both choices required courage and both involved legitimate moral reasoning. Captain Mitchell recognized that the women choosing repatriation deserved support and respect equal to those staying. She ensured they received the same assistance preparing for their future, including English language instruction for those who wanted it and information about occupation government resources in Japan. She emphasized that choosing to return home did not represent failure or lack of appreciation for American treatment. Both groups had been transformed by their time in Texas captivity. Those returning would carry different lessons than those staying, but lessons equally valuable for building a better future. June 20th, 1945. The morning arrived with oppressive humidity that made the Texas air feel thick and hard to breathe. But the heaviness in the atmosphere was nothing compared to the emotional weight pressing down on everyone gathered at the San Antonio prisoner of war facility. This was the day that would separate the Japanese women into 2 groups with radically different futures. 28 would board transport trucks bound for processing centers where they would eventually be shipped back to occupied Japan. 14 would remain behind, transitioning from enemy prisoners to displaced persons seeking permanent residence in America. The finality of the separation made it feel less like a farewell and more like a death. The women who were leaving had packed their few belongings into canvas bags provided by the military. They wore the same worn uniforms they had arrived in 8 months earlier, though the clothes hung differently on bodies that had gained weight from American food abundance. They stood in loose formation outside the barracks, their military discipline softened by months of transformation, but still visible in how they carried themselves. Captain Sarah Mitchell walked slowly down the line, shaking each woman's hand and offering personal words of encouragement. She had grown to know these prisoners as individuals, had watched them struggle with impossible choices, had witnessed their courage in confronting truths about their country that shattered their sense of identity. Chieko Yamada, who had articulated the moral case for returning to help rebuild Japan, stood near the front of the group. She had spent the previous evening writing letters to each of the 14 women who were staying, expressing gratitude for their friendship and asking them to remember Japan with compassion despite everything. Emiko Sato would carry those letters as painful reminders that transformation and separation often went hand in hand. The women boarding the trucks included the 3 who had received word that family members might have survived. They clutched those precious Red Cross letters, as if the paper itself could protect them from the uncertainty ahead. Private Jack Morrison stood near the transport vehicles, his young face struggling to maintain professional composure. He had brought something wrapped in brown paper, which he handed to Chieko with obvious embarrassment. Inside was a small Texas flag and a hand-carved wooden star he had made during long evening shifts. "So you remember that Americans can be your friends," he said simply. Chieko accepted it with tears streaming down her face, bowing deeply in the Japanese gesture of profound respect and gratitude. Sergeant Tom Rodriguez had organized similar small gifts from other guards, tokens that acknowledged these women as human beings whose lives mattered beyond their status as former enemies. The 14 who were staying stood apart, watching their companions prepare to leave. The separation felt wrong somehow, as if they should all remain together after surviving so much shared trauma. Yuki Nakamura embraced Chieko for a long moment. Two women who had supported each other through months of grief and transformation, now facing completely different futures. They spoke in rapid Japanese, making promises to write letters, to remember each other, to carry forward the lessons they had learned together. Akiko Tanaka, the youngest of all the prisoners, clung to one of the departing women who had been like an older sister to her. Captain Mitchell gave her final address to those departing. "You came here as our enemies," she said, her voice carrying across the assembled group. "You leave as something we never expected, as friends. I hope you will carry back to Japan the message that Americans believe in redemption, in second chances, in the possibility that former enemies can become partners in building a better future." Emiko translated, her voice breaking on certain words that held too much meaning to remain purely linguistic. The truck's engine started, breaking the moment with mechanical indifference to human emotion. The women climbed aboard slowly, each looking back at the camp one final time. As the vehicles pulled away, both groups waved until distance made individual faces impossible to distinguish. The 14 remaining stood in silence long after the dust settled, feeling the weight of their choice settle onto their shoulders like a physical burden. 1965. The restaurant sat on a busy corner in Houston, Texas, its red and white awning proclaiming Akiko's American Diner in letters visible from 2 blocks away. Inside, the lunch rush was in full swing, booths filled with construction workers, secretaries on break, and families with children who had never known a world at war. Behind the counter, wearing a crisp white apron over a blue dress, stood Akiko Tanaka Morrison. She was 39 years old now, American citizen, wife of Jack Morrison, and mother of 3 children who spoke English with Texas drawls and only fragments of their mother's native Japanese. She moved through her restaurant with easy confidence, calling out orders to the kitchen staff, refilling coffee cups, and chatting with regular customers who knew her simply as the friendly woman who made the best burgers in Houston. The restaurant had been Jack's idea 5 years earlier when he left his job at the Veterans Hospital to pursue something they could build together. Akiko had been hesitant at first, uncertain whether Americans would patronize a restaurant owned by a former Japanese prisoner of war. But Jack's optimism had proven justified. The food was good, the prices fair, and Akiko's genuine warmth made everyone feel welcome. Her accent, still noticeable after 20 years, had become part of the restaurant's charm rather than a source of suspicion. Regular customers asked about her children, shared their own family stories, treated her as a valued member of the community rather than a former enemy. On this particular afternoon, a tour bus pulled up outside carrying Japanese businessmen visiting Houston for a trade conference. They filed into the restaurant, speaking Japanese among themselves, and Akiko felt her heart clench with the old, complicated feelings that never entirely disappeared. She greeted them in their native language, watching their surprise at hearing fluent Japanese from this American diner owner. They asked questions about her story, and she gave them the abbreviated version she had perfected over the years. Captured in the Philippines, treated well by Americans, chose to stay and build a new life. She didn't mention the years of struggle learning to think in English, the nightmares about her parents she still sometimes had, or the profound loneliness of existing between two cultures without fully belonging to either. One of the businessmen ordered a cheeseburger, and Akiko smiled as she wrote down the order. 20 years ago, she had stared at her first cheeseburger with revulsion and fear, convinced it might be poisoned. Now she made hundreds of them weekly, had taught her children to appreciate the simple perfection of good beef and melted cheese on a toasted bun. Food had been the bridge that first allowed her to see Americans as human beings rather than demons. Now food was her livelihood and her contribution to a community that had given her a second chance at life. That evening, after the restaurant closed and the last dishes were washed, Akiko sat in her small office doing paperwork. On the wall hung a photograph from 1945 showing 14 young Japanese women, standing with Captain Sarah Mitchell and several guards outside the San Antonio camp. She looked at her younger self in that photo, barely 19, terrified but trying to appear brave. Next to it hung her American citizenship certificate from 1950 and her business license from 1960. 3 documents that told the story of transformation from enemy prisoner to American entrepreneur. Emiko Sato had become Dr. Emiko Henderson, teaching Japanese language and culture at Rice University while raising 4 children with her American husband. Yuki Nakamura had earned her nursing degree and eventually became director of nursing at a local hospital, known for her combination of precision and compassion in patient care. The 14 who had chosen to stay had all found their paths, contributing to American society while maintaining threads of connection to their Japanese heritage. Letters still arrived occasionally from Japan, forwarded through the International Red Cross. Some of the women who had chosen repatriation in 1945 had survived the difficult years of occupation and reconstruction. They wrote about the new Japan emerging from the ashes, democratic and peaceful. They wrote about children growing up without the militarism that had poisoned their own generation. That night, lying in bed while her family slept, Akiko whispered a prayer of gratitude in Japanese to parents she would never see again, then a prayer in English to the country that had offered her a second chance. Both prayers felt equally sincere. She had become what she needed to become, forever transformed by the day she chose American captivity over Japanese freedom.